There is a patch of red clay on Jamestown Island in Virginia where archaeologists spent 4 centuries being told they were not allowed to dig. The clay sits on the banks of the James River, a few miles from where the Chesapeake Bay opens into the Atlantic. Around it, the modern world moves with its usual indifference. Tourists walk marked paths. School groups pause at information plaques. The National Park Service maintains the grounds with quiet efficiency. But this particular stretch of earth, outlined now in archaeological grid markers, remained untouched longer than almost any other colonial site in North America. Not because it was forgotten. Because it was deliberately left alone. In 2012, permission was finally granted to excavate. What the archaeologists found inside the outline of a church built in 1608 were 4 bodies, buried with a level of care that speaks to status and ceremony. Proper Christian burial. Hands crossed over the chest. Bodies facing east, toward Jerusalem, as tradition required. One man had been interred with full military regalia. Another with a captain's leading staff, the symbol of command authority. The graves had been dug to the proper depth. The positioning was exact. These were not the hasty burials of crisis. These were the burials of men who mattered. 20 feet away, in what had once been a cellar, the archaeologists found something else. Bones. Human bones. With marks on them. The marks were deliberate. Made with tools. Marks that told a story the historical record had refused to tell for 400 years. Marks that raised questions about what survival had required when every other option had been exhausted. Both discoveries came from the same layer of earth. The same 6-month period. The winter of 1609 to 1610. The honored graves and the disturbing evidence existed side by side, separated only by the width of a wall that no longer stood. In the fall of 1609, 500 English colonists lived inside a fort at Jamestown. The fort measured just over 1 acre. Roughly the size of a football field. Wooden walls, built high enough to stop arrows. 2 gates, kept locked when danger pressed close. Inside those walls, 500 people went about the business of survival in a land that had not welcomed them. By the spring of 1610, 60 were left alive. 440 deaths in 6 months. No battle caused it. No single catastrophe that could be pointed to and named. Just a slow, grinding reduction of human life, measured in the frozen ground and the graves that multiplied faster than the living could dig them. What happened during those months was not documented. Not in the way other colonial disasters were recorded. There are no detailed reports from that winter. No letters sent back to England describing conditions. No official logs recording the daily count of the dead. The Virginia Company, the joint stock corporation that funded Jamestown, issued reports to its investors. Those reports mentioned difficulties. They acknowledged losses. But they did not describe what those losses looked like, or how they occurred, or what the survivors had been forced to do to remain among the living. For 400 years, the only accounts of that winter came from men who had reason to minimize what happened. Men whose reputations, whose livelihoods, whose very right to hold authority rested on a version of events that could be published and defended. The ground kept a different record. Archaeology does not deal in shame or justification. It deals in layers. In objects left behind. In the physical evidence of what people did, regardless of what they said they did. The bones found in the cellar were not there by accident. Someone put them there. Someone broke them apart with tools designed for butchering animals. Someone tried to extract what nourishment remained in tissue and marrow after a human being had died. The bones were not the bones of enemies. They were not the remains of combat or conflict with the Powhatan people who controlled the land around the fort. These were English bones. The bones of colonists. Of people who had sailed together across the Atlantic. Who had lived inside the same acre of ground. Who had, at some point during that winter, become something other than neighbors. The question is not whether cannibalism occurred at Jamestown during the winter of 1609 to 1610. The bones prove that it did. The question is who knew? Who gave permission? Who maintained enough authority during those months to conduct proper burials for some while evidence of the unspeakable was being hidden a few yards away? The Jamestown colony was not supposed to fail. It was England's attempt to establish a permanent foothold in North America after earlier efforts had vanished or collapsed. It was funded by investors who expected profit. It was populated by gentlemen and craftsmen and laborers who expected opportunity. By 1609, it had been operating for 2 years. There had been hardships. There had been deaths. But the colony had survived, and survival, in the calculus of colonial ventures, was itself a kind of success. Then, in September of 1609, the man who had held the colony together through intimidation and force of will was injured in a gunpowder explosion and forced to sail back to England. Captain John Smith left Jamestown in the hands of a man wholly unprepared for what was about to happen. What followed was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow constriction. A tightening of possibilities until only the unthinkable remained. The bones in the cellar and the graves in the church are evidence of the same winter. The same crisis. The same 1-acre space where 500 people discovered that the structures of civilization are thinner than anyone wants to believe. For 400 years, no one would say what happened that winter. The ground had to tell the story the documents refused to. To understand why the graves stayed hidden for 400 years, you have to understand who was in command when everything fell apart. George Percy arrived at Jamestown in the spring of 1607 with the first wave of permanent settlers. He was 27 years old. The 8th son of the Earl of Northumberland. Educated. Literate. Accustomed to a world where problems were solved by people whose names he would never need to know. In England, Percy's birth had guaranteed him a position in society but no inheritance. Younger sons of nobility lived on the margins of wealth, close enough to comfort to understand it, far enough from power to never control it. Virginia offered something England could not. The possibility of becoming someone. Percy kept a journal during his early months in the colony. The entries reveal a man with an eye for detail and a temperament suited to observation rather than command. He described the landscape of Virginia with something approaching poetry. The forests. The rivers. The abundance of game and fish. He wrote about the native peoples they encountered with a mixture of fascination and unease. His were the observations of a man on an adventure. Not the calculations of a man preparing for catastrophe. The man Percy would eventually replace was nothing like him. Captain John Smith was a soldier. A pragmatist. A veteran of European wars who had survived capture and enslavement by the Ottomans. Smith had no gentle birth to fall back on. No education that taught him how the world should work according to books. He understood how the world worked because he had fought his way through it. Smith's method of leadership at Jamestown was brutal and effective. He enforced a simple rule: those who did not work did not eat. He led foraging parties into Powhatan territory and negotiated for corn with a combination of trade and threat. When negotiation failed, he took what he needed at gunpoint. The Powhatan leader, Wahunsenkaw, whom the English called Powhatan, understood Smith. Respected him in the way one respects a dangerous animal. The two men maintained a balance born of mutual wariness. The colonists hated Smith. He worked them too hard. Showed too little deference to rank. Treated gentlemen like laborers. But they survived under him. The death rate dropped. The food stores grew. The fort held. In September of 1609, a spark from a lit matchlock fell into Smith's powder bag. The explosion tore through his legs and torso. The burns were severe enough that staying in Virginia meant dying in Virginia. He had no choice but to sail back to England for treatment. Before he left, Smith met with Percy. The details of that conversation do not survive. But Smith's assessment of the situation, recorded later, was clear enough. He claimed he left the colony with plenty of provisions. A secure fort. Capable leadership in place. Percy accepted command because someone had to. Because he was next in the chain of authority. Because saying no would have required explaining why he was unsuited for a position his birth said he deserved. On paper, Percy's qualifications were adequate. He was of gentle birth. He could read and write. He understood the structures of authority and the importance of maintaining proper records for the Virginia Company. What he did not have was experience leading men in the wilderness. He had never negotiated with the Powhatan. Had never commanded during crisis. Had never made the kind of decisions where hesitation meant death. His training had prepared him to document. To observe. To report on what others had decided. It had not prepared him to be the one deciding. Within weeks of Smith's departure, the fragile balance Smith had maintained began to shift. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Wahunsinkaw, had tolerated the English presence for 2 years. Tolerated their demands for corn. Tolerated their expansion beyond the original fort. Tolerated their arrogance and their guns. Smith's departure was seen for what it was. An opportunity. The trade that had kept Jamestown supplied with food stopped. Foraging parties that ventured beyond the fort walls began to disappear. Not all at once. 1 man here. 3 men there. Enough to make the point without provoking open war. Percy tried to negotiate. He lacked Smith's leverage. The Powhatan knew it. By October, the situation had deteriorated beyond diplomacy. Percy's journals from the early fall of 1609 are detailed. Careful. He recorded the daily business of the colony with the thoroughness of a man who understood that records mattered. Disputes between colonists. The arrival of new supplies. The construction of additional buildings. The kind of administrative detail that would reassure investors in London that Jamestown was functioning as a proper English settlement. In November, the entries become shorter. By December, they become sparse. By January of 1610, there is almost nothing. The silence in Percy's record-keeping during the worst months of the crisis is not the silence of a man too busy to write. Percy had been writing regularly for 2 years. He knew how to maintain a journal under difficult conditions. He had done it through summer heat and sickness and conflict. This was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a man who understood that some things, once written down, could not be unwritten. That documentation created a record that would follow him back to England. That would be read by the Virginia Company. That would define not just what happened, but who was responsible for it happening. The winter of 1609 to 1610 would later be called the Starving Time. But that name would not be given to it until years afterward, when enough distance had been established that the words could be said without requiring too much detail about what starvation had actually looked like. What it had driven people to do. What it had revealed about the limits of order when food runs out and the cold does not stop and the gates remain locked because opening them means certain death. Percy's silence during those months is one of the few things about the Starving Time that is well documented. What is not documented is why he stopped writing. Whether it was failure or choice. Whether he could not bring himself to record what he was seeing, or whether he understood that his authority rested on no one ever reading an accurate account of what happened under his command. The man who had arrived in Virginia with detailed observations about the landscape and the weather and the native customs stopped observing at the exact moment when observation would have mattered most. What happened in the months when Percy was not writing can only be reconstructed through what was left behind. The bones in the cellar. The graves in the church. The careful burial of men with rank and the hurried disposal of evidence that some line had been crossed. As the situation worsened, Percy's record-keeping, the one thing he was trained for, the one skill that justified his position, began to fail. Or perhaps, it began to be deliberately withheld. What made Percy's command impossible was not just his inexperience. It was what happened in October, when Powhatan decided the English had overstayed their welcome. In October of 1609, Wahunsinkaw made a decision that would test every assumption the English had brought with them across the Atlantic. He ordered a siege. From the Powhatan perspective, the logic was straightforward. The English had arrived 3 years earlier asking for permission to settle on land that was not theirs. They had been permitted to stay, in the way one might permit guests to remain, with the understanding that hospitality has limits. Those limits had been tested repeatedly. The English had demanded corn at gunpoint. They had kidnapped Powhatan leaders to force negotiations. They had burned villages when trade terms were refused. They had expanded beyond their original fort and showed no signs of leaving. The man who had held them in check through a combination of force and unpredictability was gone. In his place was someone who understood negotiation as a series of formal requests backed by the weight of nothing. Wahunsinkaw understood something the English were still learning. That authority in Virginia did not flow from titles or birthright. It flowed from the credible threat of violence and the will to use it when necessary. Percy had neither. The siege was not an act of savagery. It was strategic application of pressure by a people who controlled the land and had decided the guests had become invaders. Warriors took positions in the forest surrounding the fort. Arrows for anyone who emerged through the gates. No pitched battle. No dramatic assault. Just patient, persistent containment. The English were locked inside 1 acre of ground. Trapped behind walls they had built to protect themselves. The fort at Jamestown measured exactly 1.05 acres. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1990s and 2000s established the dimensions with precision. About the size of a football field. Wooden walls, built from logs stood on end, risen to a height of 15 feet. 2 gates. Wells dug inside the compound to ensure water supply during siege. In September of 1609, 500 people lived within that space. The walls that were supposed to protect them became the perimeter of their prison. Fort design in the early 17th century followed principles developed during European wars. High walls to stop arrows and musket fire. Bastions at corners for defensive positions. Wells within the compound so that water could not be cut off. Food stores kept in locked buildings under guard. The idea was to create a space that could be defended indefinitely, where defenders had advantage over attackers. The design assumed the siege would eventually be broken. That relief would come. That the enemy would exhaust their will to wait before the defenders exhausted their supplies. It did not account for what happens when the siege lasts months instead of weeks. When relief does not come. When the supplies run out and the gates cannot be opened because the forest is full of men with bows and the winter is too cold to last a night outside the walls. Percy's fort became a container. And containers, when they hold too much for too long, eventually fail. Captain John Smith had claimed, before his departure, that he left the colony with plenty of provisions. Enough to sustain the population through winter until spring planting or resupply from England. The archaeological record tells a different story. Excavations of the trash pits and cellars from the winter of 1609 to 1610 reveal a timeline of desperation that can be read in layers of bone and refuse. October into November. Horse bones. Cut marks on the long bones show they were butchered with care. Meat removed systematically. Marrow extracted. Horses had been brought from England at enormous expense. Each one represented an investment the colony could not afford to lose. They were transportation. They were status symbols. They were worth more alive than dead. By November, they were food. December. Dog bones. Every dog in the colony appears in the refuse pits from this period. Large dogs, small dogs, all butchered and consumed. Dogs that had been brought for hunting and companionship. Dogs that served functions beyond meat. None of that mattered when the alternative was starvation. January. Rat bones. Gnaw marks on some of the rat bones indicate they had already been feeding on something else before they were caught and eaten. The colonists were consuming scavengers that had been consuming refuse. The line between food and filth had blurred beyond recognition. Late winter. Boot leather. Fragments of tanned hide, marked with teeth impressions. Book bindings, eaten for the glue. Anything organic that could be chewed and swallowed. Percy would later write, in his carefully worded memoir, that the colonists ate whatever would keep them from dying. He did not elaborate on what whatever included. His contemporary records from that winter say almost nothing. The fort had water. 2 wells, dug deep enough to reach the water table. So the people trapped inside were not dying of thirst. In some ways, that made it worse. Starvation with water is slower. More conscious. You remain lucid as your body consumes itself. Muscle breaks down first. The body consuming itself to keep vital organs functioning. Then organ function begins to fail. The heart weakens. The immune system collapses. Small infections become fatal. Medical estimates suggest that a human being can survive 60 to 90 days without food, depending on body mass and conditions. Every day of that period, the person remains lucid. Capable of speech. Capable of watching others go through the same process. The siege lasted from October through March. 5 months. Long enough for the entire cycle to play out multiple times. Long enough for the survivors to watch wave after wave of death move through the population, knowing they would be next unless something changed. Nothing changed. The burial rate inside the fort increased dramatically during December, January, and February. Archaeological evidence shows graves dug in ground frozen hard enough to require multiple men with picks and shovels hours to break through. Some graves held multiple bodies. The efficiency burial of crisis, when the living cannot keep pace with the dead. But not all graves were hasty. The 4 men buried in the church chancel were interred individually. Proper depth. Proper orientation. Ceremony conducted despite conditions that made ceremony an expenditure the colony could not afford. Social hierarchy, it seems, survived starvation. The elite were still buried as elite. Even when it required resources that could have been used to extend the lives of others. Even when the labor required to dig a 6-foot grave in frozen ground represented calories that men who were starving did not have to spare. Order was maintained for some. Structure preserved where preservation was possible. The graves in the church represent a choice. Someone, Percy, presumably, as the acting governor, decided that maintaining the forms of civilization mattered more than the efficiency that crisis demanded. That some men deserved honor even when honor was expensive. 20 feet from those honored graves, in the cellar, other choices were being made. Choices that honor would not permit to be spoken. Choices that left cut marks on human bone. Both sets of choices happened in the same space. Under the same authority. During the same winter. One of the individual graves in the church stands out in the archaeological record. The burial includes a captain's leading staff. A symbol of command authority. Military regalia. The artifacts of a man who held rank. The leading staff was not just decorative. It was functional. Used in the organization of troops. In the establishment of order. In the visible demonstration that someone was in charge. Someone important died that winter. Someone whose authority was significant enough that Percy ordered, or allowed, a burial that would announce to the survivors that structure remained. That rank still mattered. That civilization had not entirely collapsed. The identity of that man is not certain. Historical records suggest it may have been Captain Gabriel Archer, one of Percy's rivals for authority within the colony. If it was Archer, then Percy buried a man who had challenged his leadership with full military honors. Either an act of respect or an act of political necessity. A message that the hierarchy would be maintained regardless of personal conflict. Or perhaps it was neither respect nor necessity. Perhaps it was simply what men of a certain class did. They buried their own with honor because to do otherwise would be to admit that the structures defining their world had failed. While they maintained those structures above ground, something else was happening below. Order was maintained for some. While for others, something else was happening that no one wanted to write down. In 2012, archaeologists found evidence that someone in that fort crossed a line their culture considered unthinkable. The question is not whether it happened. The bones prove it did. The question is, who knew? In the spring of 2012, archaeologists working in the cellar of what had been a building near the Jamestown church found fragments of a human skull mixed among animal bones and colonial refuse. The fragments were small. Scattered. They had been lying in Virginia clay for 402 years, in a location that suggested disposal rather than burial. Not hidden, exactly. But not honored either. Placed where trash was placed. Where things were put when they no longer served a purpose and needed to be forgotten. The skull fragments were sent to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. To Dr. Douglas Owsley, a forensic anthropologist who had spent decades studying human remains. Determining age, sex, ancestry, cause of death. Reading stories written in bone. Owsley had examined thousands of skeletons. Colonial burials. Civil War soldiers. Victims of historical crimes and disasters. He understood what bones could say and what they could not. The difference between evidence and speculation. When he examined the Jamestown skull fragments, he found marks that took him longer than usual to interpret. Not because they were unclear. Because they were clear in a way he had not expected to see in a colonial American context. Someone had butchered this person's skull for food. The skull belonged to a girl. Approximately 14 years old. Analysis of the bone structure and dental development confirmed the age. European ancestry, almost certainly English. She had died during the winter of 1609 to 1610, based on the soil stratigraphy and the context of the other artifacts found in the same layer. The archaeologists needed something to call her. Jane. A placeholder name for a person whose real name had been lost to time and record-keeping that never considered her important enough to preserve. Jane died at Jamestown. How she died originally, disease, starvation, accident, the bones cannot say. What happened to her body after death is written in the skull with precision that 4 centuries have not erased. Forensic analysis of bone is a matter of pattern recognition. Understanding what different tools leave behind. How force applied at specific angles creates specific marks. The difference between injuries sustained in life and modifications made after death. The marks on Jane's skull were post-mortem. Made after she had died. After blood had stopped flowing. After the body had been recognized as no longer a person but something else. A resource in a place where resources had run out. The back of the skull showed chop marks. The kind of marks made by a heavy blade. A cleaver or a small axe. Struck multiple times at roughly the same location. But what stood out to Owsley were the hesitation marks. A hesitation mark in forensic analysis indicates an attempt that did not follow through. A strike that did not commit. Evidence that whoever was doing this paused, reconsidered, or lacked the will to complete the action on the first try. Jane's skull showed 4 distinct chop marks in the same area. The first 2 had not penetrated the bone. They had struck and stopped. Shallow cuts that would have required the blade to be lifted and the attempt made again. The third mark went deeper. The fourth finally cracked through. Someone had tried to open Jane's skull. Had raised the blade, brought it down, and pulled back. Had tried again. Had hesitated again. Had finally, on the 3rd or 4th attempt, broken through to what lay inside. The pattern is inconsistent with violence. With murder. With the quick brutal efficiency of someone accustomed to butchering. It is consistent with someone who did not want to be doing what they were doing. Someone who had to force themselves to continue. Someone for whom this act required overcoming resistance that made the blade falter. Hesitation marks are evidence of reluctance. Of a threshold being crossed by someone who understood they were crossing it. Additional marks on the skull told the rest of the story. Cuts along the jaw consistent with removing the tongue. Scraping marks on the cheekbones consistent with removing facial tissue. All the marks post-mortem. All made with purpose. The brain. The tongue. The tissue of the face. These were being extracted for consumption. Not in a moment of madness. Not in frenzy. The marks are too controlled for that. Too methodical. Someone was doing this carefully. Trying to extract what nutrition remained in a body that had already died. Owsley's analysis noted that the tool marks were consistent with implements the colonists would have had. Kitchen tools. Blades used for preparing food under normal circumstances. Now being used for something that every person in that fort would have been raised to believe was the ultimate transgression. Jane's skull was not the only evidence found. Other bones from the same period, recovered from the same trash context, showed similar marks. Limb bones with cut marks at the joints. Evidence of dismemberment. Long bones that had been broken open, the marrow inside extracted. The pattern was not isolated. Not the act of one desperate individual hiding in a corner. Multiple bodies had been processed this way. Multiple people had participated or known or chosen not to interfere. Jane's skull became the focal point of analysis because it was the most complete. Because the hesitation marks told a story that statistics and patterns could not. Because it represented not just what happened, but the psychological cost of what happened. Someone had to make the decision to do this. Someone had to pick up the blade. Someone had to bring it down on the skull of a 14-year-old girl who had been, days or weeks before, a member of their community. And they hesitated. That hesitation is its own kind of evidence. What the bones can say with certainty is limited. Jane died during the winter of 1609 to 1610. She was approximately 14 years old. She was English. After her death, her body was dismembered and the remains processed for consumption. Her skull was then discarded in a cellar that served as a trash pit. What the bones cannot say is how she died originally. Whether she was sick, starved, or succumbed to one of the other causes that were killing colonists throughout that winter. There is no evidence of violence before death. No healed fractures or bone disease that would have marked her life. She appears in the archaeological record only at the moment of her death and what came after. The bones cannot say who made the decision to butcher her remains. Whether it was an individual acting alone or a group decision. Whether permission was sought from whatever authority still functioned in the fort. Whether Percy knew. Whether he sanctioned it. Whether he could have stopped it. The bones cannot say whether Jane was alone in this or one among many whose remains were treated the same way but whose bones have not yet been found or have degraded beyond recovery in 4 centuries of Virginia weather. What the bones can say is that the taboo was broken. Not once but multiple times. Not in a frenzy of survival but with enough deliberation that tools were selected and used with care. That bodies were processed and remains disposed of in ways that suggest an understanding that this needed to be done out of sight. The colonists at Jamestown in 1610 were products of English culture. Christian. Raised with an understanding of the body as sacred. The dead to be treated with reverence. Burial rites to be observed. The consumption of human flesh was not merely prohibited. It was unthinkable. The mark of savagery. The boundary between civilization and its absence. And yet the boundary was crossed. The question that Jane's skull raises is not whether people are capable of crossing that boundary when survival demands it. History has answered that question repeatedly. People are capable of nearly anything when the alternative is death. The question is what happens to the structures of authority when that boundary is crossed. Whether leadership sanctions the transgression or merely fails to prevent it. Whether the decision is made collectively or imposed by those who still hold power. Whether anyone asks permission or whether the act happens in silence and is buried in silence and remains silent until the ground itself is opened 400 years later. The archaeologists called her Jane because her real name was lost. She was approximately 14 years old. English. That is all the bones can tell us about who she was. What happened to her body tells us about the winter. About the desperation that makes the unthinkable inevitable. About the moment when the structures that separate civilization from survival collapse and people are left to make choices they will spend the rest of their lives not talking about. Who she was as a person, her thoughts, her fears, her reasons for coming to Virginia, the family she left behind, the future she imagined, those are gone. Buried deeper than bones can preserve. What remains is evidence. Cut marks on a skull. Hesitation in the blade strikes. The physical record of a moment when someone stood over a body and had to decide whether to continue being the person they were raised to be, or to become someone who could survive. Jane's skull proves that the taboo was broken. But bones cannot tell us who gave permission. Or if permission was even asked. For that, we have to look at who was still keeping records. And what they chose not to record. George Percy's job as acting governor of Jamestown included one responsibility that superseded almost everything else. Documentation. The Virginia Company, the joint stock corporation funding the colony, operated on information. Investors in London needed to know what their money was producing. How many colonists survived? What resources had been discovered? What conflicts had emerged? What prospects existed for profit? Without documentation, the colonial venture was invisible. Without reports, there was no way to justify continued investment. No way to recruit new settlers. No way to maintain the fiction that Virginia was anything other than an expensive experiment yielding nothing. Percy understood this. His education had prepared him for exactly this kind of administrative responsibility. The keeping of records. The writing of reports. The translation of events into language that could be sent across an ocean and read by men who would never set foot in Virginia but whose continued support determined whether the colony lived or died. For 2 years, Percy had been writing. And then, during the worst months Jamestown would ever experience, he stopped. Before the crisis, Percy's documentation was thorough. Thousands of words describing Virginia's landscape. The daily machinery of the settlement. Disputes. Deaths. Construction. The observations of someone who understood that London would read these reports and make decisions based on them. In October of 1609, as the siege began, his entries remained steady. The closing of the gates. The positioning of guards. The rationing of supplies. By November, the entries have shortened. Single paragraphs where there had been pages. December brings almost nothing. A few sentences about scarcity. No details. January, February, March of 1610. The months when the archaeological evidence shows the worst of the dying. When Jane's skull tells us the line was crossed. When the refuse pits filled with evidence that 400 years would try to bury. From those months, Percy's contemporary records are nearly silent. 8 years later, in 1618, a man named John Rolfe wrote to the Virginia Company. Rolfe had married Pocahontas. Had been at Jamestown through the recovery years after the starving time. His letter asked a simple question. Why had no official inquiry ever been conducted into the deaths of the winter of 1609 to 1610? The Virginia Company received the letter. Noted it in their records. Filed it. Never replied. The question was allowed to fade. Not answered. Just absorbed into the silence that was already 400 years in the making. Percy himself had contributed to that silence from the beginning. 15 years after the starving time, in 1625, Percy finally produced a written account. By then he was back in England. No longer in the Virginia Company's service. No longer dependent on the goodwill of investors who might ask uncomfortable questions. The account is titled, A True Relation of the Proceedings and Occurrences of Moment Which Have Happened in Virginia. It runs to several thousand words. It is the most detailed description of the winter of 1609 to 1610 that exists from someone who was there. And it is carefully, methodically vague about the worst of what happened. Percy admits to famine. He describes the siege. He lists the progression of what was eaten. Horses, then dogs, then rats, then boot leather. He acknowledges that people died in numbers that left the survivors barely functional. He uses the word misery repeatedly. But when he reaches the moment where his account should describe how people survived after the horses and dogs and rats were gone, the language shifts. Some were driven to that which they would not else have done. 8 words. Passive construction. No subjects. No specifics. No acknowledgement of what that means. Driven. As if by force beyond their control. As if no one chose. As if the act had no author, no agent, no responsibility attached. That which they would not else have done. A description that describes nothing. That names the transgression by refusing to name it. Percy knew what happened. He was there. He was governor. But 15 years later, when he finally wrote about it, he could not bring himself to say the words. Or he understood that saying the words would require answering questions he had spent 15 years avoiding. Percy's memoir includes other details that the passive voice cannot quite hide. He mentions that the colonists dug up corpses from graves. That bodies of the recently dead were taken from burial plots during the night. He does not say by whom. He does not say with whose permission. He does not say whether this was organized or chaotic. Whether authority sanctioned it or pretended not to see. He mentions, briefly, a man who killed his pregnant wife, salted her body, and had eaten part of her before being discovered and executed. Percy includes this story almost as if it were an exception. An aberration. The one case where the transgression was so extreme that it demanded response. But the detail raises its own questions. If that man was executed for killing and consuming his wife, what happened to those who consumed the already dead? Were they punished? Were they simply overlooked because their transgression was technically less than murder? Or were they overlooked because acknowledging what they did would require acknowledging that leadership had lost control? Percy does not say. His account moves quickly past the detail. Offers no context. No explanation for why that case demanded execution while other acts of consumption, evidenced by the bones found 400 years later, appear to have gone unpunished or at least unremarked upon in any surviving record. The other accounts from people who were at Jamestown during the starving time are similarly evasive. Sir Thomas Gates arrived in May of 1610 to find 60 survivors. His report back to the Virginia Company describes their physical condition. Emaciated. Weak. Looking like skeletons. Crying out that they were starved. He describes his decision to evacuate immediately. His judgment that the colony was not recoverable. What he does not describe is what those survivors told him about how they survived. Whether they volunteered the information. Whether he asked. Whether he wanted to know. The Virginia Company's official report, published later in 1610 to reassure investors, is even more sanitized. It acknowledges losses. Blames them on disease, Indian attacks, and unfortunate weather conditions. It frames Jamestown's crisis as temporary. Unfortunate but manageable. The kind of setback that any colonial venture might face. Nowhere in the official report is there mention of starvation severe enough to drive people to cannibalism. Nowhere is there acknowledgement that the colonial project came within days of complete abandonment. Nowhere is there suggestion that leadership failed in any fundamental way. 3 separate sources. 3 men with different perspectives and different incentives. Percy, who was there and in command. Gates, who arrived and witnessed the aftermath. The Virginia Company, which needed to maintain investor confidence. All 3 rode around the truth. All 3 used language that acknowledged suffering while obscuring what that suffering produced. All 3 protected the narrative at the expense of the record. The pattern suggests something larger than individual choice. It suggests institutional decision. A collective understanding among everyone with authority that certain things, once said, could not be unsaid. That the colonial project depended on a version of events that could be defended. That could be published. That could be used to recruit the next wave of settlers. The truth about the starving time threatened that version. Not just because it was horrifying, but because it revealed how close the entire venture had come to collapse. How fragile English civilization was when stripped of everything but cold and hunger and locked gates. Investors did not need to know that. Future colonists did not need to know that. England did not need to know that. So the silence held. Percy wrote almost nothing at the time. Wrote carefully 15 years later. Gates reported conditions without causes. The Virginia Company published reassurance. And for 400 years, the only versions of the starving time came from people who had reason to minimize it. Documentation creates accountability. Once something is written, it can be read, copied, questioned. It becomes part of the official record. Part of history. Part of the evidence that defines what happened and who was responsible. Percy would have understood this. He would have known that anything he wrote about the winter would eventually reach London. Would be read by investors. By the Virginia Company leadership. By people who would judge not just what happened but how it was handled. Whether the acting governor maintained order or presided over chaos. Whether structure held or collapsed. If Percy knew that cannibalism was occurring in the fort, writing it down would create a permanent record of his failure to prevent it. If he sanctioned it, writing it down would make him complicit in an act that English law and Christian teaching both condemned as monstrous. If he did not know, writing anything about the conditions that made it possible would raise the question of why he did not know what was happening inside 1 acre of ground under his command. Any honest documentation of that winter would destroy whatever authority he had left. So he wrote almost nothing. The question is whether that silence was failure or whether it was the only way Percy could protect what was left. Whether it was cowardice or pragmatism. Whether it was covering up crimes or covering up the price of survival. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the silence itself is the answer. That some things cannot be written down because writing them down makes them real in a way that memory does not. That documentation creates responsibility where survival requires its absence. Percy's job was to maintain records. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, that documentation stopped. The question is whether that silence was failure, or choice. To understand what Percy might have known, we have to look at who he was still burying with honor while evidence of cannibalism was being hidden 20 feet away. The church at Jamestown was not large. A wooden structure, perhaps 40 feet long, 20 feet wide. Built in 1608 to serve the spiritual needs of colonists who believed that establishing proper English worship in Virginia was as important as establishing trade or defense. Inside, toward the eastern end, was the chancel. The most sacred part of the church. The area reserved for the altar and for clergy. In English tradition, it was also where the most important members of the congregation were buried. Nobility. Wealthy benefactors. Those whose status in life earned them proximity to the altar in death. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, 4 men were buried in the Jamestown church chancel. 4 individual graves, dug to proper depth in frozen ground. 4 bodies laid to rest with ceremony while outside the church walls, people were dying faster than the living could process what death meant anymore. The archaeological evidence of these burials tells a story about what Percy chose to preserve even when preservation required resources the colony did not have. The first burial that archaeologists identified with certainty was Captain Gabriel Archer. The identification came from a combination of factors. The location in the chancel. The presence of a captain's leading staff buried alongside the body. The approximate age and build of the skeleton matching what historical records suggested about Archer. Archer had been at Jamestown since 1607. A gentleman. Educated. A rival to John Smith and, by extension, to Percy. The two men had competed for influence within the colony's leadership. Had disagreed on policy. Had represented different factions among the settlers. Archer died in December of 1609 or January of 1610. The exact date is not recorded. What is recorded, in wood and iron and bone, is that Percy ordered him buried with full honors. The leading staff was not decorative. It was functional. Used to signal troop movements. To establish formation. To mark the position of authority on a field or in a fort. Burying Archer with that staff was a statement. That rank persisted beyond death. That the hierarchy remained intact. That civilization, or at least its symbols, still functioned. Digging a grave in January in Virginia requires effort that people who are starving cannot easily afford. The ground freezes. Frost penetrates several inches deep, sometimes more. Breaking through requires picks and shovels and hours of work. Work that burns calories bodies do not have to spare. A proper Christian burial requires a grave 6 feet deep. Deep enough that animals cannot reach the body. Deep enough that the dead rest below the level where the living walk. 6 feet of frozen Virginia clay. Multiple men working in shifts because no single person has the strength to sustain the effort. Hours taken from other tasks. From the search for anything edible. From the maintenance of defenses. From the care of the sick. For a single burial in the chancel, this expenditure might be justified. But there were 4. 4 graves dug to proper depth. 4 bodies interred individually rather than in the mass graves that were becoming common outside the church walls. Each grave represented a choice. That this person mattered enough to warrant the expense. That the forms of civilization would be maintained for them even when maintaining those forms cost the living something they could barely afford to give. The second identifiable burial in the chancel included a wooden coffin. Would that could have been used for fuel? For repairs to buildings? For any of a dozen purposes that would have contributed to survival. Instead, someone built a coffin. Planed the boards. Fitted them together. Created a container whose only function was to separate one body from the earth for a few years until the wood rotted and the separation ended. Coffins in early colonial America were expensive. Reserved for those with means or status. Most colonists were buried in shrouds. Cloth wrapped around the body. Simple. Efficient. Adequate for the transition from life to grave. A coffin required carpentry. Time. Material. It was not a necessity. It was a statement about who deserved more than necessity. During a winter when the living were consuming boot leather and rats, someone built a coffin for a dead man. All 4 bodies in the chancel were positioned identically. Laid on their backs. Hands crossed over the chest or abdomen. Heads to the west, feet to the east. Facing Jerusalem. The traditional Christian burial orientation. The position that said this person died in the faith and would rise facing the direction of salvation. Proper Christian burial was not just about respect for the dead. It was about maintaining the structure that separated the English from those they considered savage. About demonstrating that even in Virginia, even during crisis, they remained civilized. They followed ritual. They observed tradition. They were not, despite everything, reduced to animals. The bodies in the chancel were proof of that claim. Physical evidence that order persisted. That someone still had authority enough to command the living to honor the dead properly. That someone was Percy. The contrast with what was happening 20 feet away could not be more stark. In the cellar that served as a trash pit, bodies were being processed for consumption. Skulls opened with cleavers. Bones broken for marrow. Remains disposed of among refuse. No ceremony. No orientation toward Jerusalem. No recognition of the person who had inhabited that body. In the church, bodies were being honored. Buried with symbols of rank. positioned according to tradition. Separated from the earth by wooden coffins. Both were happening in the same 1-acre space. Under the same command. During the same weeks when the cold did not break and the gates stayed locked and the forest remained full of Powhatan warriors who had decided the English experiment had run long enough. Percy was governor of both realities. The question is whether he presided over them or simply failed to prevent them. Whether the honored burials and the evidence of cannibalism represent two different systems operating in parallel, or one system maintaining its facade while reality unfolded beneath. The honored burials and the hidden evidence existed side by side. Whether Percy maintained order while permitting transgression, or lost control while clinging to ritual, or chose not to see what he could not stop, the bones cannot answer. What the bones do establish is that both realities existed simultaneously. That Percy commanded enough authority to conduct proper burials in the church. That somewhere in the same space, people were processing human remains for food. One of the shovels used to dig the honored graves was found in the same cellar where Jane's skull was discovered. The same tool. Both purposes. The distance between the two uses was 20 feet of frozen ground. All three explanations may be true. Or none. Or something in between that has no clean category. What remains certain is that Percy's authority rested on maintaining appearance. On demonstrating through burial and ceremony that order persisted. On showing that rank and ritual still meant something even when they cost resources survival could barely spare. The alternative was admitting that leadership had failed. That authority had collapsed. That there was no one in control. Percy chose to maintain the appearance. Buried the elite with honors that proved someone was still giving orders. Chose not to document what maintaining that appearance required looking away from. He buried the elite with honor and buried the evidence of what kept some of them alive. Both burials were, in their way, necessary. One for the historical record. One for the actual survival. In May of 1610, Sir Thomas Gates arrived from Bermuda expecting to resupply a functioning colony. What he found instead was something that made him order immediate evacuation. Not reinforcement. Evacuation. Abandon Jamestown entirely. On May 23, 1610, two ships appeared on the James River sailing toward the fort. They carried Sir Thomas Gates, the newly appointed governor of Virginia, along with roughly 150 men and supplies meant to reinforce what was expected to be a functioning colonial settlement. Gates had not planned to arrive so late in the season. He had sailed from England the previous summer as part of a fleet meant to deliver hundreds of new settlers and ample provisions. His ship, the Sea Venture, had been caught in a hurricane off Bermuda. Driven onto reefs. Wrecked but not destroyed. The passengers and crew survived. Spent 9 months on Bermuda building new ships from the wreckage and local timber. Finally sailing to Virginia expecting to find a colony that had weathered one winter and was preparing for spring planting. What Gates found when he came ashore was something his experience as a colonial administrator had not prepared him for. 60 people. Out of 500 who had been alive when he left England 10 months earlier. His description, recorded shortly after arrival, used the word anatomies. Skeletons. People so emaciated that bone structure was visible beneath skin that had nothing left beneath it to provide shape. People who moved slowly, spoke weakly, and repeated a single phrase over and over. We are starved. We are starved. Gates had overseen colonial ventures before. Had managed settlements. Had dealt with food shortages and conflict and the ordinary hardships that came with establishing English presence in territories that resisted that presence. But this was different. This was not hardship. This was collapse. The fort was in disrepair. Palisade walls showed damage that had not been fixed. Buildings had been partially dismantled for firewood. The gates hung awkwardly on broken hinges. Fields that should have been prepared for planting lay untouched. The storehouses were empty not just of food but of the tools and materials needed to acquire food. Gates had arrived with supplies sufficient to resupply a settlement. not to resurrect one. Within days of his arrival, Gates made a decision that shocked the survivors and would later puzzle historians. He ordered the complete evacuation of Jamestown. Everyone was to board the ships. The fort was to be abandoned. The entire English colonial project in Virginia, 3 years and enormous investment and hundreds of deaths, was to be left behind. Not reinforced. Not rebuilt. Abandoned. The decision tells us something about what Gates saw or what he was told that his official reports did not include. An experienced administrator does not order total abandonment lightly. Does not give up on an established settlement unless he believes continuation is impossible or inadvisable for reasons that go beyond simple resource shortage. Gates had the supplies to feed 60 people. He had men to rebuild defenses. He had the authority and experience to reorganize a failing colony. He chose not to try. Whatever he learned from the survivors in those first days convinced him that Jamestown was not recoverable. That the ground itself was compromised. That the best option was to take everyone who could walk, sail downriver, and never return. On June 7, 1610, the evacuation was completed. Every surviving colonist boarded Gates' ships. The fort was left behind. Empty. The graves in the church would remain undisturbed. The evidence in the cellar would remain hidden under collapsed buildings and accumulating soil. The ships sailed down the James River toward the Chesapeake Bay. Toward the Atlantic. Toward the end of the Jamestown experiment. For the first time in 8 months, the survivors were outside the walls that had contained them. The forest was no longer something seen through gaps in the palisade. The river was no longer the boundary of a prison. They were leaving. Finally. The winter was over in a way that went beyond season. They sailed through the night. By morning, the fort was miles behind them. On June 8, 1610, a ship was sighted coming upriver from the bay. A large ship, English, flying colors that indicated someone of rank aboard. Lord de la Warr, the newly appointed governor and captain general of Virginia. Arriving from England with 3 ships, more settlers, and provisions sufficient to sustain a colony for a year. De la Warr's orders to Gates were immediate. Turn the ships around. Return to Jamestown. Resettle the fort. The survivors had been outside the walls for the first time since October. They had felt wind that was not filtered through palisade gaps. They had seen the forest as something other than the perimeter of their prison. They had slept without the sound of others dying in the darkness nearby. Some had wept when the gates first closed behind them as they boarded Gates' ships. Relief that felt physical. The weight of 8 months lifting. One day of that. Then the order came to turn around. One survivor, whose name is not recorded in any document, jumped overboard when he understood they were returning. He swam toward the far shore. The current was strong. He was pulled back to the ship. Brought aboard. He did not speak again during the journey back to the fort. When they passed through the gates he had thought he would never see again, he walked to the corner of the compound farthest from where the honored dead were buried and sat with his back to the wall. He appears only once in later records. 3 months after de la Warr's arrival, his name is listed among the dead. The cause is not specified. Not all wounds are visible. Not all deaths are from starvation. Some historians suggest this forced return broke something in the survivors that the winter itself had not broken. That the trauma was not just what they endured but what they were forced to return to. That escape and recapture is its own category of suffering. By June 10, they were back inside the walls at Jamestown. When de la Warr took command, Percy was relieved of his governorship. The expected consequence of failure so obvious that rescue ships had found evacuation in progress. But Percy was not disgraced. Not sent back to England in chains. Not stripped of rank or position. He remained in the colony as a captain. Continued to serve in military capacity. Was given command of a different settlement a year later. Held the position of governor again, briefly, in 1611 and 1612. His service after the starving time was marked by continued conflict with the Powhatan. By aggressive military campaigns that he led personally. By a reputation for effective if brutal command in combat situations. There was no investigation into what happened during the winter of 1609 to 1610. No formal inquiry into how 500 colonists became 60 under his watch. No trial. No tribunal. No requirement that he explain in detail what had occurred. The Virginia Company's response to the starving time was to send more supplies and more settlers and to continue operating as if the crisis had been an unfortunate but ultimately surmountable obstacle. Percy's silence was not challenged because challenging it would require an investigation. An investigation would require testimony. Testimony would require someone to say, in an official capacity that would be recorded and sent back to London, what had happened inside the fort during those months. No one in authority wanted that said. Percy returned to England in 1612. Lived quietly for the next 2 decades. Held minor positions. Managed family estates after his older brothers died. Wrote his memoir in 1625, 15 years after the starving time, with its careful passive voice and its refusal to specify what some were driven to actually meant. He died in 1632. 22 years after the winter that should have ended his career but instead became something that was simply not discussed. Not investigated. Not documented beyond the bare minimum required to explain why 440 people had died. Percy was never punished because punishment would require a trial. A trial would require evidence. Evidence would require the kind of documentation that he had spent the winter of 1609 deliberately not creating. The Virginia Company needed the colony to survive. Needed investors to continue funding it. Needed settlers to continue arriving. A full accounting of the starving time would threaten all of that. Would make Virginia synonymous not with opportunity but with horror. Would attach to the colonial project a stain that no amount of later success could fully wash away. So the silence held. Percy carried what he knew. The survivors carried what they had done or seen or survived through. And the official version of events remained vague enough that later generations could interpret it as they wished. For 400 years, the only accounts of the starving time came from people who had incentive to minimize it. From men whose authority rested on a version of events that could be defended. That could be published. That would not end careers or collapse investor confidence or make the entire Virginia project look like a mistake that had produced monsters instead of colonists. Then, in 2012, archaeologists started digging. And the ground told a different story. The red clay of Jamestown looks the same as it did in 1610. The same iron-rich soil that turns rust-colored when dry and clings to tools when wet. The same ground that held the fort, the graves, the evidence of what happened when 500 people were reduced to 60. 412 years passed between the winter of the starving time and the excavation that finally opened the church chancel and the cellar where Jane's skull was found. For centuries during which the ground kept what the documents would not say. The archaeological grid marks are visible now. White strings stretched between stakes, dividing the site into measured squares. Each square mapped and photographed and excavated layer by layer. The church foundation is outlined in the clay. The graves have been opened, studied, respectfully closed. The artifacts catalogued. The bones analyzed. The physical evidence has been recovered. What it proves and what it suggests are now part of the record in a way they were not before 2012. But evidence answers some questions and deepens others. What we know with certainty is limited but significant. We know that 440 colonists died between October 1609 and May 1610. We know the death rate accelerated through the winter months. We know the archaeological refuse shows a progression from horses to dogs to rats to materials never meant for consumption. We know that human remains were butchered and processed for food. That multiple bodies were treated this way. That the evidence was disposed of in contexts that suggest disposal rather than burial. That whoever did this understood it needed to be hidden. We know that 4 men were buried in the church chancel with ceremony and expense during the same period. That proper Christian burial was maintained for the elite even when maintaining it required resources the colony could barely afford. We know that George Percy kept detailed records before the crisis and wrote almost nothing during the worst months. That 15 years later he produced an account that acknowledged suffering while obscuring specifics. That he used passive construction to describe transgressions without assigning responsibility. We know that the Virginia Company's official reports minimized what happened. That no formal investigation was conducted. That Percy retained his position and his reputation. What we do not know is whether Percy explicitly sanctioned cannibalism or whether it occurred beyond his authority. Whether he maintained order while allowing transgression or whether order collapsed and he simply preserved the appearance of control through ritual burial of the elite. We do not know if the survivors asked permission or acted in secret. If there was organization to how bodies were processed or if it happened in chaos with different groups making different choices. We do not know if Percy's silence was protection of the narrative or protection of people who had done what survival required. The gap between what we know and what we cannot know is where the story lives. There are 2 versions of Jamestown that exist in the same space. The Jamestown of the historical record is a story of English determination. Of colonists who faced extraordinary hardship and survived. Who established the first permanent English settlement in North America despite conflict with indigenous peoples, despite disease and starvation, despite leadership failures and supply problems. It is a founding narrative. Part of the mythology that leads eventually to American independence and national identity. In this version, the starving time is acknowledged but contained. A terrible winter. Many deaths. Unfortunate but ultimately overcome. The colony recovered. Grew. Became the foundation for Virginia and, through Virginia, for the nation that would emerge more than a century and a half later. This version is taught in schools. Appears in textbooks. Is presented at the reconstructed fort where tourists walk and guides explain the challenges of colonial life in ways that emphasize courage and perseverance. The Jamestown of the archaeological record is something else. It is evidence of what happens when every system fails simultaneously. When leadership cannot lead, when supplies cannot arrive, when the siege cannot be broken, when people are trapped in a space too small with death accumulating faster than it can be processed. It is Jane's skull with hesitation marks. It is bones broken open for marrow. It is graves dug for the elite while evidence of transgression is hidden in cellars. It is documentation that stops precisely when documentation would matter most. It is reports that use language designed to obscure rather than clarify. It is institutional silence maintained across 400 years until the ground itself is opened and forced to speak. This version does not contradict the founding narrative. It complicates it. Adds weight that the simplified version cannot carry. Suggests that the foundation of English America includes not just determination and courage but also desperation and choices that could never be defended once the crisis passed. Both versions existed in the same space. One above ground, ceremony, order, honor. One below ground, desperation, transgression, burial. The question is not which version to believe. The question is what it means that we spent 4 centuries preserving one while burying the other. The church burials were real. Percy did maintain ceremony for the elite. Did demonstrate that authority functioned. Did preserve the forms of civilization even when preservation was expensive. The evidence of cannibalism is equally real. People did cross the line that culture and religion both forbade. Did survive by consuming the dead. Did hide what they had done in ways that suggest they understood it could not be acknowledged. One story happened above ground. In daylight. With witnesses and ceremony and artifacts that declared permanence and status. The other story happened in shadows. In cellars and hidden spaces. With evidence disposed of among refuse and secrets maintained through collective silence. Percy governed both. Whether he governed them or simply existed in a position called governor while they happened around him is a question that his silence makes unanswerable. There is a way of understanding authority that sees it as a performance. That power is maintained not through control of every action but through control of the narrative. Through the ability to determine what is official and what is not. What is documented and what is ignored. What is buried with honor and what is buried without record. In this understanding, Percy's authority during the starving time rested on his ability to maintain the performance. To continue conducting proper burials. To demonstrate that structure persisted. To keep the machinery of governance operating even when that machinery controlled less and less of what actually happened. The silence in his records was not failure of documentation. It was the documentation strategy. What is not written does not officially exist. What does not officially exist cannot be used to question authority. Cannot be used to establish responsibility. Cannot be used to suggest that leadership failed in ways that go beyond simple inability to prevent starvation. The honored burials were proof that authority functioned. The absence of records about everything else was proof that authority knew what needed to be protected. When those in charge choose silence over documentation, they make a choice about what future generations will know. About what questions can be asked and answered. About who gets remembered and how they get remembered. For 400 years, we knew Jamestown through the version that authority chose to preserve. Through Percy's careful memoir. Through the Virginia Company's sanitized reports. Through historical accounts that acknowledged the starving time while treating it as an unfortunate anomaly rather than a revelation about what colonial projects cost the people who actually lived through them. The archaeological excavations did not discover new information so much as they recovered information that was always there. Buried deliberately. Left unspoken. Preserved in bone and soil and the physical evidence that unlike documents cannot be edited to protect reputations. The question that remains is not what happened. The bones answer that. People died. Survivors consumed the dead. Leadership maintained ceremony for some while transgression occurred for others. All of this happened in 1 acre of frozen ground over 6 months that no one wanted to document honestly. The question is what we do with that knowledge now that the ground has given it up. Whether we understand Percy as a leader who made impossible choices in an impossible situation. Or as a failure who lost control and spent the rest of his life hiding behind silence. Or as something between those extremes. A man who maintained the appearance of civilization while understanding that survival required looking away from what happened in the spaces that appearance did not cover. Perhaps all 3 readings are true. Perhaps that is what makes the story unbearable to write down. That authority in crisis is not heroic or cowardly but both and neither. That survival requires transgression and transgression requires silence and silence becomes its own kind of lie that compounds across centuries until someone digs up the ground and forces the truth into a light it was never meant to see. The fort still stands at Jamestown. Reconstructed now according to archaeological evidence and historical accounts. A museum. A national historic site. Every year, tens of thousands of visitors walk through the gates, stand in the church, look at the foundations of buildings where colonists lived and died. The guides tell the story of John Smith and Pocahontas. Of early English settlement in Virginia. Of hardship and perseverance and the founding of a colony that would become essential to American history. The starving time is mentioned. The guides acknowledge it. 440 deaths in 6 months. A terrible winter. The worst crisis the colony faced. Most of the guides do not mention Jane. Do not mention the butcher marks on her skull. Do not mention the hesitation that someone showed before finally breaking through bone to reach what lay inside. Most visitors do not see the cellar where her remains were found. Do not stand in that space and imagine what it meant that evidence was hidden there while honored graves were being dug 20 feet away. The ground remembers what the tour does not include. George Percy lived 22 years after the starving time. Held positions of respect in England. Managed family estates. Lived quietly. Died in 1632 at the age of 52. He never spoke publicly about the winter of 1609 to 1610 after writing his carefully worded memoir in 1625. Never gave interviews. Never provided additional detail. Never answered the questions that his silence had created. What he carried to his grave stayed there. Leadership was buried in the church with ceremony and symbols of rank. Evidence was buried in the cellar among refuse and animal bones. For 400 years, we chose to excavate one and leave the other undisturbed. The ground kept both. The ground keeps everything. And when we finally opened it, when archaeologists were finally allowed to dig where they had been told for centuries they could not dig, the ground gave back what silence had tried to bury. Not answers. Evidence. The bones do not explain Percy's choices or the survivors' desperation or the institutional decision to minimize and obscure and move forward without accountability. But they prove that what happened was real. That the cost of survival was higher than the documents would say. That the foundation of English America includes not just courage and determination but also hunger and transgression and the choice to look away from what acknowledgement would make unbearable. The question that haunts every investigation, every excavation, every attempt to understand what happened during those months remains. When those in charge choose silence, when documentation stops at the moment it matters most, when evidence is buried and narrative is protected and 400 years pass before the ground is finally opened, is that leadership? Is that complicity? Is that simply what authority does when the truth threatens the structure that authority depends on? Maybe all of those. Maybe none. Maybe the answer changes depending on whether you are asking about survival or asking about accountability. Whether you are judging decisions made in crisis or judging the silence that followed. The ground does not answer that question. The ground only remembers. And what it remembers is this, that in the winter of 1609, 500 people were locked inside 1 acre of frozen ground, and by spring only 60 remained, and what happened during those months was so unbearable that the people who survived it and the people who governed it and the people who invested in it all agreed that silence was preferable to truth. The silence held for 400 years. The ground held longer.